Hello, friends. We're continuing our discussion of the sixth sign in John's Gospel, the healing of the man born blind. And in this short video post, I want to compare the formerly blind man with the religious leaders who were interrogating him. And I want you to think about this question. It's really a challenge, if you please. As we go through this discussion, I want you to think about this question with me. Am I more like the formerly blind man whom Jesus healed, or am I more like the religious leaders? Okay, let's first talk about this formerly blind man whom Jesus healed. He's being grilled by the religious leaders for a second time. And it's important to note that they don't want Jesus to receive any credit for the gift of this man's sight. Jesus is becoming too popular for them. He doesn't honor their man-made Sabbath laws. He's a threat to their power and their influence. And so they only have one thing in mind. It's not to get to the facts. It's not to discover what happened or to answer the question, why or how did it happen? All they care about is bringing Jesus down in the eyes of the public and bringing him down as a religious leader. So, what do we learn about the formerly blind man in his second encounter with these religious leaders? Well, first of all, I'm going to suggest that he finds a foundation for his faith in Jesus in his experience. Now, the leaders come to him and they say, "We know that this man is a sinner." And how does the blind man respond? He says, "Well, I don't know if he's a sinner, but I know this. I was blind, but now I see." I like that. He sidesteps the theological quibble of how one might define a sinner and just explains his experience of Jesus. This was the condition I was in before I met Jesus. This is the condition I'm in now that I have met Jesus. He's just sharing his experience. I was blind, but now I see. And his faith in Jesus is based upon his experience of Jesus. Secondly, I want to say that this blind man makes complete sense. He's rational, he's reasonable, he's logical. The leaders come to him and they say, "Now we know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this Jesus, we don't know where he comes from." And here's the blind man's response to that statement. It's found in verse 30 of John chapter 9. "Here's an astonishing thing," he says. "You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes." Now, if we were to paraphrase this, it's the blind man saying, "Now that's a wonder that you don't know where Jesus comes from. I was blind, and he opened my eyes. I was blind, but this man enabled me to see. Only God can give sight to the blind. If Jesus were not from God, he could not have opened my eyes." You see how his argument, his thinking makes perfect sense. It's rational, it's reasonable, it's logical. And by the way, we could say a lot more about the nature of faith here, couldn't we? Faith in Jesus is reasonable. It makes sense. I like it. It's all very logical for this formerly blind man. It makes perfect sense to him that the man who healed him certainly did come from God. Now, let's contrast the formerly blind man with the religious leaders. I'm going to suggest, first of all, that they are just as closed-minded as they can possibly be. They are unwilling to consider the facts and the logical consequences that derive from those facts. Their mind is already made up. Jesus cannot be the Christ. He cannot be a divine being. He cannot have come from God because he does not observe their law, their man-made law about the Sabbath. I think in verse 27, the formerly blind man really makes the point and drives it home when he says, "You just won't listen. I've told you my condition over and over again, how it all happened, and you just won't listen." No, they won't listen. They are closed-minded. And second, I'm going to suggest that they are very arrogant. Now, you may not have noticed this, but in John chapter 9, 3 times we are told that the blind man doesn't know. He says, "I don't know, I don't know." He expresses his lack of knowledge. He shows his humility 3 times, and not coincidentally. John chapter 9 tells us that the religious leaders 3 times express their confident statements about what they know about Jesus. We know this, we know that, we know this. They didn't really know anything at all, and yet they were arrogant when they thought that they did. Now, what do they do in response to this blind man's experience and to his rational thinking? Well, verse 34 tells us their response. When all else fails, verse 34, they answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out of the synagogue. In other words, they practiced what we commonly hear today as an ad hominem argument against the man. You know, when you can't present reasonable arguments for or against a thing, you attack the person's character, his or her motivation, or some other attribute of the person in order to undermine his or her argument. We hear that a lot in politics, I hate to say. When you can't answer an argument, you attack the person. Well, that's what these religious leaders did. They attacked this blind man, and they cast him out of the synagogue. Now, I want to come back to the story one more time. I want us to talk about Jesus' conversation at the end of chapter 9 with this blind man. But before I leave you, let's end where we started. Let's revisit that question I asked us to think about. Are you more like this? Are you more like the religious leaders of Jesus' day, who were closed-minded, who were arrogant, who thought they knew what they did not know, who were not willing to consider the evidence, who were not willing to rationally discuss where the evidence might lead? Or are you more like this formerly blind man, open to new things, open to new truth, a new perspective, a new way of looking at things, open to wherever the evidence might lead? Well, of course, I hope that each of us is more like that blind man than we are the religious leaders of Jesus' day. I want to talk about the difference between spiritual blindness and spiritual obtuseness in our next session together. And until then, may we all keep an open mind.